The morning they decided I was disposable, I was standing in my kitchen waiting for the kettle to settle. It was a plain Thursday. Gray light at the window. My laptop open beside a bowl with 2 untouched apricots. I had just finished cleaning coffee grounds off the counter when a message came through from a vice president who still did not know how to pronounce my last name. Be ready to justify why you're still here. I read it once. Then again. I did not answer right away. I set the phone face down and listened to the kettle click itself off. A few days later, a signed memo would end up in my bag, folded in half so neatly it almost looked harmless. But that morning, all I had was one line on a screen and the feeling that something quiet had already begun. My name is Nora Hale. I was 38 then, living alone in Durham, North Carolina, working from a small apartment with a weak radiator and a desk I had made out of an old dining table. Officially, I was an outside compliance systems consultant. On paper, I sat behind a vendor name and a contract buried low enough in the company structure that most people never saw it. In practice, I had built the core logic behind the platform Norvale was selling to regional banks. They called it an operations engine. That was the polished version. What it really did was decide whether certain financial actions could move forward without breaking the internal rules banks cared about. It watched timing, approvals, credential chains, audit behavior. It checked whether a company was doing what it had promised to do. And if something was changed the wrong way, it did not panic. It simply raised its hand. That part was mine. I had been working with Norvale for a little over 2 years. No office. No badge photo on internal slides. No cheerful mention in all-hands meetings. Most people inside the company could have passed me in a grocery store and never known who I was. I liked it that way. I have never cared much for titles. I prefer systems that work. The only executive who understood that was Adrian Cross, the CFO. Adrian was not warm exactly, but he was steady. Our calls were usually short. He would ask 1 or 2 direct questions, leave room for silence, and let me build what needed to be built. He did not ask for presentation decks. He did not ask me to simplify technical decisions so they could fit on a strategy slide. He wanted the architecture to hold under pressure. So I made sure it did. By the time this started, the platform had already passed 2 difficult reviews with bank partners. No one celebrated the details. They just liked the result. The alerts fired when they should. The logs matched the approvals. The compliance pathways held. That tends to be how this kind of work goes. If you do it well, people forget it is there. Then Adrian disappeared. Not dramatically. No announcement. No company-wide message with supportive language and careful spacing. I got a short note from his assistant saying he was out on medical leave for an unknown period and that urgent matters would be routed elsewhere. Elsewhere turned out to be Scott Vance. Scott was vice president of strategic operations, which sounded useful until you spent 10 minutes with him. He liked expensive shirts, short deadlines, and language that made simple things sound important. He joined meetings late and used phrases like visibility alignment and cost discipline as if they meant the same thing as understanding a system. They did not. The first week Adrian was gone, Scott started appearing everywhere. New leadership calls, product check-ins, budget reviews he had ignored for months. He asked questions in a flat, confident tone, the kind people use when they assume volume can replace knowledge. Who owns this function? Why is this still external? Can we rationalize this line item? At first, he referred to me as the compliance resource. Then that consultant under finance. He said my name once on a call and got it wrong. I corrected him. He did not apologize. He just kept talking. Outside, rain tapped the window screen. Inside, my apartment smelled faintly of printer heat and the onion soup my neighbor made every Wednesday. I kept working. That is what I have learned to do during reorganizations. You do not rush to explain yourself. You do not perform urgency for people who enjoy watching it. You keep notes. You save copies. You let patterns form. So I watched. Scott began asking for weekly impact summaries from everyone. Slide updates. Roadmaps. Utilization reports. He liked anything with colored status markers. He trusted presentation more than structure. Some people respond well to that sort of management. I never have. The thing Scott did not understand was that my work was not a deck or a status line. It lived inside the logic. Approval paths, authentication checks, traceable handoffs. I had also built one quiet safeguard into the core module months earlier, with Adrian's approval. If a credential tied to the compliance engine was removed without the proper sequence, the system would not fail loudly. It would simply stop trusting the change until the chain was reviewed. Not a trap, just protocol. Still, protocol tends to feel personal when someone ignores it. By the second week, Slack channels were being renamed. Reporting lines were shifting. Engineers who had been left alone for years were suddenly being asked to explain themselves in summary bullets. One senior developer sent me a private message late at night that said, "He's asking who can be consolidated." I read that too. Then I archived it. Friday afternoon, Scott sent the message that had come through while my kettle was cooling. "Be ready to justify why you're still here." No greeting, no context. I looked at the words for a while, then opened the version logs instead. My commits were there. My signatures were there. The record was clean. I exported what needed exporting, saved what needed saving, and went back through the contract Adrian had arranged under the shell vendor. Calmly, line by line. That evening the sky turned the color of wet concrete. I ate toast over the sink and kept reading. At 7:18 the next morning, a calendar invite arrived. Brief sync, 8:30 a.m. bring documentation of deliverables. I accepted it without comment. Then I waited. At 8:24 the next morning, I was standing outside Scott's office with a legal pad in one hand and my laptop tucked under my arm. Norvale's headquarters were in a glass building near the old tobacco district, the kind of place with polished concrete floors and a lobby that always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Someone had placed fresh eucalyptus near reception. The scent was sharp enough to notice, not strong enough to cover the burnt coffee coming from the machine near the elevators. Scott's office sat along the interior wall, all glass panels and brushed metal trim. It looked less like a place to work and more like a place to be seen working. He was already inside when I arrived, typing with both hands in short, uneven bursts. When he noticed me through the glass, he smiled in a way that suggested he had already rehearsed the meeting in his head. He waved me in without standing. "Nora, come on in." I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. There was no offer to sit at first. Just Scott, a smooth desk, and a printed folder placed squarely in front of him. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt and glanced at the clock on the wall as though punctuality had always mattered to him. "I'll keep this simple," he said. "We've completed a review of external spend and role alignment." I set my laptop down but did not open it. He continued, "Your current involvement appears difficult to justify under the new operating structure. There's no direct reporting line, no formal owner designation inside our active org, and frankly, too much ambiguity around where your responsibilities begin and end." I let him finish. People like Scott often hear interruption as resistance and silence as uncertainty. That misunderstanding has helped me more than once. He slid the folder forward a few inches. "We're terminating the arrangement effective immediately," he said. "You'll be paid through the vendor as agreed. But from this point on, all company materials, code, local files, and supporting documentation need to be removed from your devices. Everything you built under this contract belongs to Norvale." He paused there, studying my face. I looked down at the folder, then back at him. "Can I have that in writing?" I asked. His expression shifted, just slightly. He had expected pleading, I think. Or at least surprise. Instead, he opened the folder, took out a single sheet, and handed it across the desk. It was already signed. That part interested me. The memo was brief, formal enough to sound official, careless enough to be useful later. It stated that my services were no longer required under the vendor arrangement and that all proprietary data, systems, and related materials held locally were to be permanently deleted. His name sat at the bottom in blue ink, hard pressure on the signature line. I read it once. Then I folded it in half and placed it in my bag. "Understood," I said. He leaned back a little, almost disappointed. "No questions." "Not at the moment." I picked up my laptop and legal pad. He still had not offered me a chair. As I reached the door, he added, "For what it's worth, this is just a structural decision. Nothing personal." That sentence appears often in places where the damage is very personal. I nodded once and left. The elevator ride down was quiet. On the second floor, a product manager stepped in, saw me, and started to say something, then changed her mind. We rode the rest of the way in silence. In the lobby, the receptionist avoided my eyes while I signed out my temporary badge. Somewhere behind me, a printer started up without dry, mechanical sound office printers make when they have no idea what they're helping with. By 9:05, I was back at my apartment. The radiator hissed once and fell still. A truck backed up outside with a long electronic beeping sound. I set my bag on the chair by the door, washed my hands, and made coffee before I touched the laptop. I have always believed in doing one ordinary thing before dealing with an ugly one. It keeps the room from changing shape around you. Then I sat down and began. I did exactly what the memo instructed. I removed the local repository mirror from my machine. I deleted the test environment. I cleared the cached documentation bundle. I removed design notes, architecture drafts, validation scripts, rollback maps, and local reference files that had only ever existed because I had needed them to do the work correctly. I did not keep hidden copies. I did not move anything into private storage under another name. I did not improvise. I followed the order. But there was a distinction Scott had not understood. My laptop was not the system. It never had been. The live platform, the active compliance logic, the credential chains, and the audit behavior all existed within Norvale's operational environment. My local files helped me maintain and extend that structure, but the critical design choices had already been embedded where they were meant to be. That included the validator Adrian, and I had approved months earlier, the one tied to authorized credential handling. A system like that does not react to ego. It reacts to sequence. And sequence had now been broken. Before shutting everything down, I opened a secure archive Adrian, and I had set up long before any of this started. He used to call it the rainy day drawer. It was encrypted, isolated, and limited to a narrow class of documents we both considered too important to leave scattered around the company. Vendor agreements, approval notes, implementation confirmations, exceptions tied to bank-facing compliance design. I logged in and added one new item, the memo. Scanned, timestamped, saved. Then I closed it. No speech, no message to anyone inside Norvale, no warning. I put the phone face down. Around noon, private messages began to arrive. Not many, just enough. One engineer wrote, he told people this was part of a cleanup. Another said, they're moving ownership around and people are confused. A third, someone from infrastructure who rarely contacted me directly, sent a single line, did anyone formally offboard your credential chain? I did not answer immediately. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote down the time each message arrived. That may sound cold. It was not. It was orderly. A little after 1:30, I received the first sign that the system had noticed what Scott had done. It did not come as an alarm to me. It came as silence where activity normally lived. One shared dashboard, I still had passive visibility into stopped updating. A routine trust check that usually refreshed every few minutes had frozen in place. Then an automated external status marker switched from active to pending review. That was enough. I set down my mug and looked carefully through the sequence in my head. Scott had issued a deletion order. My local environment had been removed. No formal offboarding procedure had been initiated through the approved compliance pathway. No transfer owner had been assigned. No credential assurance step had been logged, which meant the validator would do exactly what it was designed to do. It would pause trust, surface the inconsistency, and wait for a proper review. Again, not dramatic, just exact. At 2:11 p.m., an email reached the secure vendor inbox I still monitored for contractual notices. It was from a bankside compliance contact I knew only slightly. She was careful, precise, and not inclined to waste words. The subject line was clinical. Unexpected credential event detected. Review required the body was shorter still. A credential associated with a monitored trust segment had been removed without matching deactivation records. They wanted internal clarification from Norvale. Until then, certain operational assurances would remain under review. I read the message once and closed it. Then I stood up, rinsed my coffee cup, and opened the kitchen window a few inches. Outside, the air was damp and cool. Somewhere below, a dog barked twice and stopped. My neighbor's wind chime tapped softly against itself. Inside Norvale, I knew what would happen next. Legal would start asking for logs. Infrastructure would search for a ticket that did not exist. Someone in finance would realize a bank partner had paused trust on part of the compliance chain and would finally understand that I had not been an optional line item. Scott, meanwhile, would still think this was about headcount discipline. That is the problem with certain kinds of confidence. It arrives before understanding and often leaves too late. At 3:04, another message came through, this time from a former QA lead who still had friends in operations. There's an issue upstairs. Bigger than they expected. I wrote down the time. Then I waited. A little before 5, my screen lit with a name I had not seen all week. Adrian Cross. The message contained only 6 words. Did he tell you to delete it? I did not answer Adrian with an explanation. I forwarded the memo. That was enough. 2 minutes later, I got the read receipt. 3 minutes after that, a secure folder I had not seen in months opened on my screen. Adrian had reactivated an old channel we used only for exception work, the kind that sits outside ordinary workflows because ordinary workflows are usually too slow. Inside were archived approvals, implementation notes, contract language, and the original system map with the credential validator clearly marked. He had kept everything. That did not surprise me as much as it might sound. Adrian was many things, but careless was never one of them. I sat back in my chair and read through the folder in silence. The late afternoon light had started to thin. My apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft tapping of tree branches against the outside brick when the wind shifted. I could smell paper and stale coffee and the faint citrus of dish soap from the sink. Then Adrian called. His voice sounded rougher than usual, flatter around the edges. "I've seen the memo," he said. "Yes. Did you follow it?" I removed the local environment exactly as directed. He was quiet for a second. Not shocked. Measuring. "Did you retain anything outside the agreement?" "No," another pause. "Good," he said. "Stay where you are. Don't contact anyone at Norvale. I need to verify the chain for my side." "I understand." That was the whole call. No apology. No panic. Just a return to sequence. I put the phone face down and waited. By early evening, the internal story had started to change. I could feel it through the messages, even when the people sending them were trying to sound casual. A product lead wrote that legal had requested audit logs from infrastructure. Someone from finance asked whether I had ever been assigned a formal secondary owner. An engineer I trusted sent one line that told me more than the others combined. They're looking for an offboarding ticket, and there isn't one. I wrote that down too. There is a point in certain situations when a problem stops being political and becomes administrative. That is usually the point where the loudest person in the room starts sounding less certain. Not because they have grown wiser, but because records have begun to answer for them. At 6:12 p.m., Adrian sent me a limited request through the secure channel. Need validation scope only. No restoration yet. Confirm whether the trust cascade was working as designed. I read it twice, then opened a clean terminal on an isolated session he had temporarily enabled. Single-use access. Read-only permissions except for the diagnostic pathway. Exactly the kind of careful, narrow opening I would have expected from him. The logs were clean in the way only bad decisions can make them clean. The credential tied to the compliance segment had been severed without formal sequence. No approved transfer owner. No deactivation trail. No assurance pass. The validator had recognized the break and moved the trust status into review, exactly as designed. It had not overreacted. It had simply refused to certify continuity where continuity had not been established. I exported the relevant entries and attached a short note. The trust cascade performed as intended. Unsequenced credential removal triggered automatic review. No malfunction observed. Then I sent it back. No adjectives. No commentary. A little after 7, Adrian wrote again. Bank has moved to verification stage. They want confirmation from original architect. I looked at that phrase for a moment. Original architect. It is a strange thing to see your role returned to you by process after someone tried to erase it with office language. Still, I kept my response simple. Send scope. He did. The bank wanted 3 things. First, a confirmation that the validator existed as part of the approved architecture. Second, a timeline showing the deletion event against the trust review trigger. Third, a neutral technical statement on whether the issue came from design failure or procedural failure. That was when the shape of the week changed for me. Not emotionally. Structurally. Up to that point, I had been the person removed from the room. The expendable contractor. The buried expense. But once the bank requested technical assurance from the original architect, the hierarchy shifted whether Scott liked it or not. The room had changed. It just had not told him yet. I made tea before answering. Chamomile. The cheap kind in paper sachets. Steam curled against the kitchen light while I reviewed the sequence one more time. In the apartment across the courtyard, someone laughed at something on television. A cabinet door closed. Then everything settled again. I went back to the desk and worked in steps. Step 1. Confirm the architecture approval trail. Step 2. Match the deletion timestamp against the validator response. Step 3. State only what the records could prove. That is how you stay clean in moments like this. You do not decorate facts. You do not chase vindication. You let the system speak in the order it already understands. I sent the file package at 8:03 p.m. The response from the bankside contact arrived 12 minutes later. Received. This supports procedural failure, not design failure. Further internal review ongoing. I set my glasses down on the table and closed my eyes for a moment. Not relief. Not yet. Just alignment. By then, inside Norvale, the pressure had moved upward. I knew it from the pattern of the messages. No one was asking whether I had really been necessary anymore. They were asking who had signed what, who had skipped which step, who had authority, and who had assumed authority they did not have. Scott's name began appearing more often. Never in direct accusations. Not at first. Just in references. His memo. His instruction. His review. That is another thing records do. They remove the luxury of vague blame. At 8:41, one final message came in from Adrian. Be available in the morning. Legal is containing this tonight. I read it, closed the laptop, and carried my tea to the window. Rain had started again, light and steady. The parking lot below reflected the security lights in broken yellow strips. A man in a dark coat crossed between the cars holding a grocery bag close to his side so it would not get wet. I stood there for a while and listened. Then I waited. I was awake before sunrise the next morning, not because I was anxious, but because my body had already moved into procedure. The apartment was cool. The floorboards held that early chill they get before the heat has fully come through. I padded into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and stood there listening to the small sounds I always notice first when something larger is in motion. Water beginning to whisper. A truck downshifting out on the street. Pipes ticking behind a wall. I sliced an apple, put half of it back in the fridge, and opened my notebook. When you have spent enough years around unstable people in formal clothes, you learn a simple rule. They become most dangerous when they realize the room has stopped believing them. So I wrote my own rules. Step 1, say only what I can document. Step 2, do not fill silence for other people. Step 3, keep every instruction in writing. Step 4, let process carry the weight. Then I waited for Adrian. His call came at 7:16. They've suspended Scott from platform access pending review, he said. His voice was steadier than it had been the night before. Tired, but settled into the work. Legal wants a clean restoration path. Bank wants assurance before they release the hold. I need you to validate the recovery sequence. Validation only? For now. But be ready. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the pale light gathering along the window frame. Has anyone asked why there was no offboarding chain? A small pause. Yes, he said. No one has a good answer. That did not need comment. He sent the new scope while we were still on the call. Narrow permissions again. Controlled access. A temporary credential attached to a restoration review sandbox, separate from the live operational lane, but close enough to confirm what would happen if the trusted path was restored correctly. I opened the files as he spoke. There it was, all of it laid out in the quiet, exact language that systems prefer. Scott's memo timestamped before the deletion event. No linked approval. No secondary owner assignment. No coordinated revocation. No infrastructure handoff. Just a signed instruction moving faster than the structure it was trying to command. Adrian exhaled slowly on the other end. I should have locked your pathway before I left. That would have helped, I said. He was quiet for a moment. I know. That was as close to an apology as either of us needed. We ended the call and I began. This part of the work was not glamorous. It never is. People imagine turning points as speeches or public scenes. In reality, most of them happen in checklists, log entries, and quiet decisions made by people who know where to look. I reviewed the validator dependencies first. The credential anchor was still intact where it mattered. The trust chain had paused, not collapsed. That distinction mattered. It meant the system had protected itself without corrupting the underlying architecture. A clumsy human had cut the wrong wire, but the circuitry beneath it was still honest. I documented that. Then I reviewed the restoration path. The answer was almost embarrassingly simple. Reassign authorized trust oversight through the approved chain. Reestablish credential continuity. Run integrity checks. Confirm external reporting behavior. Produce a clean audit note. In other words, do what should have been done before anyone touched anything. At 8:02, a message came in from Norvale Legal asking whether I was available for a formal technical clarification later that morning. The phrasing was careful, very careful. No mention of termination. No mention of contractor review. No mention of justification. Just a request for technical clarification. I smiled at that, though only for a second. Language gets modest when exposure arrives. I replied that I was available and asked that all questions be sent in writing ahead of the call if possible. They agreed. 10 minutes later, I had a list. Was the validator intentional? Yes. Had it been approved? Yes. Was it tied to the bank-facing trust architecture? Yes. Would removal of the credential without sequence predictably trigger review? Yes. Could this have been avoided? Yes. How? By following the documented transition procedure. I answered each one in plain English and attached references to the original approval files Adrian had preserved. Nothing longer than necessary. Nothing emotional. Just enough to make denial impossible. By 9:11, the building I was not in had apparently gone very quiet. I know that because 3 separate people messaged me within 12 minutes, all in different wording, all saying roughly the same thing. This is bad for him. One from engineering. They have him in a conference room with legal. One from finance. No one is joking today. That one came from a product manager who usually joked through everything. I did not ask follow-up questions. I did not need details from the hallway. The documents were doing their work. At 10:03, the legal clarification call began. There were 4 people on it besides me. Adrian, a lawyer from internal counsel, someone from infrastructure, and a woman from the bank's review side who had the habit of letting people speak until they accidentally showed too much. No Scott. That was noted without being said. The lawyer asked me to walk through the architecture from the point of credential oversight. I did. Slowly. Not to sound superior. Just to keep the record usable later. I explained the validator in simple terms. Certain monitored functions depended on a traceable trust chain. The trust chain depended on approved credentials and formal transition steps. If those steps were skipped, the system moved into review because the conditions for trust had not been met. The bank-side reviewer asked, was that behavior documented before this event? Yes. Where? I gave her the file name, approval date, and section heading. She thanked me and made a note. Infrastructure confirmed there had been no approved transfer and no offboarding ticket. Legal confirmed the memo existed and had been issued outside the required sequence. Adrian confirmed the design itself had been approved under his office months earlier. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. That kind of call is not about emotion. It is about narrowing the room until only one version of events still fits. At the end, the bankside reviewer asked me one final question. If the approved transition is completed now, do you expect the system to return to compliant reporting status? Yes, I said, assuming the restoration follows the documented order. And can you supervise validation? I can. There was a short pause, then Adrian spoke. Good. We'll proceed. The call ended. I closed the laptop and stood up for the first time in nearly 2 hours. My shoulders ached. I rolled them once, opened the window, and let the cool air in. Down on the sidewalk, 2 people in office clothes were walking quickly with takeaway cups in their hands, talking without looking at each other. The sky had brightened into that washed silver color it gets before noon when rain is still deciding whether to come back. At 10:47, Adrian sent a single message. Restoration authorization approved. Sending temporary live validation credentials now. That was the shift. Not anger to action. Not injury to revenge. Something quieter than that. Disorder to order. I took a fresh page from the pad, wrote down the sequence I would follow, and placed it beside the keyboard. Then I logged in. The temporary credential came through at 10:52. Single use. Time limited. Narrowly scoped. I checked it twice before I touched anything. The apartment had warmed a little by then. Sunlight had begun to press through the clouds, thin and pale across the table. My tea had gone cool beside the notebook. I moved it out of the way, adjusted the lamp, and began the restoration validation in the exact order the architecture required. First, credential continuity. Then trust reassignment. Then integrity confirmation across the monitored branches. Then external reporting behavior. Nothing about the process was dramatic. It was almost quiet enough to be boring if you did not know what each line meant. But quiet work has its own force. One correct step after another. No improvisation. No ego. Just the right sequence replacing the wrong one. At 11:17, the first internal status changed from pending review to restoration in progress. At 11:26, one of the trust checks cleared. At 11:31, the audit loop accepted the reassigned authorization path. I documented each change and attached the log extracts as they appeared. Around noon, Adrian called again. They want you on site at 2, he said. I looked at the screen for a moment before I answered. Who is they? Legal. Finance. Bank liaison by video. Board counsel may sit in. They need the architecture explained in person and the restoration confirmed on the record. I understood immediately what that meant. The technical issue was almost under control. The human issue had moved to the table. Will Scott be there? Yes. That was enough. I asked for the meeting room, the attendee list, and copies of any documents they intended to place into the record. Adrian sent them within 5 minutes. That helped. It told me the room had already changed shape again. People become very efficient once consequences turn official. I closed the session, changed clothes, and packed carefully. Not much. Laptop. Charger. Notebook. Printed copy of the original validator approval. Printed copy of Scott's memo. Vendor agreement excerpt. Pen. Water bottle. I have learned that carrying only what you need keeps other people from deciding what belongs to the story. Before leaving, I washed the cup in the sink and wiped down the counter. Small thing. Still important. The drive to Norvale took 23 minutes. Traffic was steady. A landscaping truck was pulled halfway onto the shoulder near the overpass, and a man in an orange vest was gathering cones one by one. At a red light, I watched a woman in the next lane fix her hair in the rearview mirror, then laugh at something her passenger said. Ordinary life continued the way it always does while someone else's bad decision catches up to them. The receptionist downstairs looked startled when she saw me, then composed herself quickly and printed a temporary badge. Conference room 12, she said softly. Thank you. The elevator smelled faintly of carpet glue and coffee. On the 12th floor, everything was too still. No casual talking near the glass offices. No hallway laughter. A few people looked up when I stepped out, then looked away with the expression people wear when they are trying not to be seen witnessing something. Conference room 12 was at the end of the corridor. The door was open. Inside, the table had already been set with legal pads, printed packets, water glasses, and a screen at the far end showing the bank liaison's video tile waiting to connect. Adrian was there. So was internal counsel, a finance director, someone from infrastructure, and Scott. Scott was seated halfway down the table with both hands flat on a closed folder. He looked tired in a way expensive shirts cannot hide. Not messy, not undone, just reduced. The confidence that had seemed so effortless a few days earlier now sat on him like a borrowed coat. He glanced at me once as I entered, then at the memo in front of counsel, then back down again. No one made a scene of my arrival. That was right. Adrian stood just enough to acknowledge me and indicated the chair across from the screen. Nora. I sat down, placed my documents in a neat stack, and set the laptop in front of me. The bank liaison joined first, then outside counsel, then a member of the board audit committee whose face I recognized from prior approval packets. Introductions were brief. Counsel explained the purpose of the meeting in formal language, confirm the restoration status, establish the decision chain that led to the disruption, and determine immediate governance actions. Again, no raised voices. Counsel began with me. Ms. Hale, please describe your role in relation to the compliance trust architecture. I did. Not the long version. Not the wounded version. Just the true one. I explained that I had been retained under the vendor structure to design and maintain the monitored compliance logic tied to certain bank-facing assurance pathways. I explained that the validator at issue had been proposed, reviewed, and approved to prevent unsequenced credential changes from being treated as trusted transitions. I explained that the validator had operated exactly as intended. Then counsel asked, "Did you receive written instruction to delete local materials?" "Yes." "From whom?" "Scott Vance." "Did you comply?" "Yes." "Did you retain unauthorized company materials after termination?" No, that answer mattered. I could feel it land. Then the bank liaison asked for the restoration status. I turned the laptop so the room could see the summary view and walked them through it line by line. The trust chain had been reassigned correctly. The integrity checks had passed. The external review marker had shifted into supervised restoration. If the final validation cleared by end of day, the hold would likely be lifted. Likely, the finance director asked. The bank liaison answered before I could. Assuming there are no additional hidden process failures, yes. A silence followed that sentence. Not a long one, just long enough. Counsel then turned to Scott. "Mr. Vance, did you issue the written directive instructing Ms. Hale to delete local materials?" Scott cleared his throat. "Yes. Did you verify whether her credential pathway had been formally transitioned before issuing that directive?" "No. Did you consult infrastructure?" "No. Did you consult finance, compliance, or Mr. Cross?" "No. He tried once to widen the answer." I understood her role to be non-essential under the new structure and believed counsel raised one hand, not rude, just precise. The question was whether you consulted the required parties. Scott stopped. No, Adrian did not interrupt. He did not lean forward or fill the room with authority. He simply sat still and let the record narrow around what had already happened. That was the right choice. It left Scott with nothing to push against except his own answers. The board member spoke next. "Were you aware," she asked Scott, "that this architecture was tied to monitored banking assurances?" Scott hesitated too long before speaking. "I knew there were compliance implications." "That is not what I asked." He swallowed. "No, I watched him then, not with satisfaction, but with the detached attention I usually reserve for failing systems. When a structure breaks, you do not insult it. You identify the point of failure." Counsel slid the printed memo toward the center of the table. This directive ordered deletion of active materials while the credential chain remained untransitioned. "That is correct?" I answered first. "Yes." Then infrastructure confirmed there had been no ticket, no transfer, and no approved sequence. Adrian confirmed the validator had been approved months earlier. The bank liaison confirmed the resulting review action matched expected risk controls. Piece by piece, the room stopped being about opinion. It became about order. Scott tried once more. There was no bad intent here, he said. This was a structural cleanup effort. We've had visibility problems for months, and I was trying to regularize. Adrian spoke for the first time since the formal questioning began. It does not require bad intent to create measurable risk. His voice was calm, almost quiet. Scott looked at him. Adrian continued. You removed a critical function without understanding it, issued a deletion order without transition authority, and exposed the company to a preventable review hold. Those are not interpretation issues. Those are sequence failures. No one added anything to that. No one needed to. The board member folded her hands. Then let us stay with sequence, she said. And that was what we did. For the next 40 minutes, we moved through the record in order. Approval, architecture, vendor status, memo, deletion, trigger, review, restoration. Every document matched the next. Every log reinforced the timeline. Every attempt to soften the language fell away on its own because the evidence was already simpler than any defense. By the time counsel closed the folder, the reality of the situation had become stable enough to sit in the room without help. Scott was no longer debating what had happened. He was sitting beside it. At 3:18, the bank liaison asked for my final expectation on restoration. I answered plainly. If the validated sequence remains in place through the final check window, the system should return to compliant reporting status today. She nodded. Thank you. That is sufficient. Counsel then adjourned the formal portion of the meeting and asked me to remain available nearby while they completed governance discussions. Adrian looked at me once across the table, just a slight nod, the kind that means the technical part is over and the rest belongs to structure. I gathered my papers, closed the laptop, and stood. As I reached the door, I heard the board member say to counsel, "Please note that the contractor's documentation materially reduced our exposure." I did not turn around. I stepped into the hall, closed the door softly behind me, and walked to the end of the corridor where the windows overlooked the parking deck. Then I waited. I stayed by the windows for nearly half an hour. The afternoon had turned clear by then. Sunlight sat flat across the top level of the parking deck and caught on the windshields in a way that made everything below look briefly cleaner than it was. Somewhere down the hall, a copier ran through a long job. Someone laughed once softly, then stopped as if they had remembered where they were. I stood with my notebook in one hand and my badge clipped to my jacket pocket, watching two maintenance workers guide a cart across the far side of the lot. It gave me something ordinary to look at while the company I had spent 2 years quietly holding together decided how to write down what had just happened. At 3:47, Adrian stepped out of the conference room. He closed the door behind him and came over without rushing. The final validation window opens in 10 minutes, he said. If it clears, the bank will release the hold today. I nodded. And Scott? Adrian looked through the glass for a second before answering. Removed from operational authority immediately. Formal review to follow. Counsel is documenting governance failure and process breach. That was exact enough. He handed me a printed summary for the final system check. I read it once. Restoration path confirmed. Secondary oversight assigned. Audit continuity reestablished. External trust signal pending final pass. All of it looked the way it should have looked before anyone decided efficiency could replace procedure. We walked back into the room together, though by then it no longer felt like a confrontation. The emotional temperature had dropped. The table was quieter. Counsel had stacked the documents into a neat pile. Scott's chair was empty. I noticed that without comment. The bank liaison rejoined on screen at 3:58. Infrastructure reopened the monitored dashboard. Adrian sat to my left. Counsel sat across from me with her pen resting on the page, ready to note whatever the next 10 minutes would make official. The final check passed at 4:06. It happened with no ceremony at all. One status shifted from amber to green, then a second. Then the external trust marker updated and the hold notation disappeared from the summary panel. The bank liaison reviewed the timestamp, asked infrastructure to refresh once more, and then said, in the same measured tone she had used all day, operational assurance has been restored. We are releasing the temporary hold effective immediately. The finance director exhaled so quietly I might not have heard it if the room had not been so still. Counsel made a note. Adrian said, "Thank you." That was the moment things became inevitable. Not because anyone made a speech. Not because anyone was humiliated. Simply because the record had closed. The system had been restored. The exposure had been traced. The wrong decision had a name, a timestamp, and a signature. From that point on, the rest was administration. The bank liaison signed off first, then outside counsel, then the board member, who ended her portion with a short instruction to revise transition controls for all external technical functions and return with a governance update by the end of the week. After the screen went dark, the room stayed quiet for a second or two. Then counsel turned to me. "Ms. Hale, thank you for your cooperation and documentation. It materially assisted the review." "You're welcome," I said. She closed the folder in front of her. "We would like to discuss a formalized structure for your role going forward, if you are open to that." I looked at Adrian, then back at her. "I'm open to discussing terms in writing," I said. That got the smallest hint of a smile from her. Professional people usually appreciate limits when they are clearly stated. The finance director asked whether I would remain available through the week in case the bank requested follow-up confirmation. I said yes, provided all requests came through the documented channel Adrian and I had already established. Counsel agreed to that too. There was nothing more to settle in that room. I packed my papers slowly. Laptop first, then the notebook, then the two printed documents that had mattered most, the validator approval and Scott's memo. One had built the protection. The other had activated it. Between them sat the whole shape of the story. When I stood to leave, Adrian asked whether I had a minute before I went downstairs. We stepped into a smaller office near the end of the corridor. Not his old office. Just a quiet room with a round table, 2 chairs, and a window facing west. There was a plant on the sill that had not been watered recently. He closed the door. "I should have protected the transition before I went out," he said. "Yes," I replied. He accepted that without resistance. Then he added, "You were hidden too deeply. It made you easy for the wrong person to dismiss." That was true too. He set a draft paper on the table between us. A proposed interim engagement letter. Direct reporting line to finance and counsel jointly. Formal system owner designation for the trust architecture. Change control requirements that could not be bypassed by a single executive acting alone. Temporary at first. Renewable after board review. He did not try to persuade me. He simply let me read. The paper smelled faintly of toner and warm dust from the printer. Outside the window, the light had gone softer and warmer across the far buildings. "I won't answer now," I said when I finished. "I didn't expect you to." I folded the paper and placed it in my bag. He nodded once. Fair. That was all. No grand reconciliation. No emotional repair. Some things can be corrected by policy. Others can only be handled by distance and better terms. When I walked back through the corridor, people were moving again. Not normally. Not yet. But enough to suggest the floor had started breathing. A developer passed me carrying a laptop and gave me a brief look of recognition that felt more respectful than awkward. Someone in product opened a door and stepped aside so I could pass first. Down near the elevators, 2 members of infrastructure were already discussing revised control language. The company was doing what companies do after a contained disaster. Rewriting procedure. Assigning responsibility. Pretending this had all been a lesson rather than an avoidable choice. I did not resent that as much as I might have years earlier. Institutions rarely learn elegantly. They learn through records. At the lobby desk, the receptionist asked if I needed validation for parking. Her voice was steadier now than it had been that morning. I told her yes. She stamped the slip and handed it back with both hands. "Have a good evening," she said. "You too." The air outside felt different from when I had arrived. Cleaner. Less charged. The sky over Durham had started to turn the pale gold it gets before dusk, and the heat stored in the concrete was lifting back into the evening air. I stood beside my car for a moment and looked at the stamped parking slip, then folded it and tucked it into the notebook. Some people think closure arrives as a feeling. In my experience, it usually arrives as paperwork. On the drive home, Adrian sent one final message. Bank released the hold. Counsel confirms Scott is under formal review and no longer has authority over platform, vendor, or compliance functions. We'll send written terms tomorrow. I read it at a stoplight and set the phone down again. No reply. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun had dropped low enough to leave the kitchen in that soft, late light that makes even unremarkable things look settled. I placed my bag on the chair, took off my shoes, and stood in the middle of the room for a few seconds without moving. Then I opened the cabinet, took out a clean glass, and filled it with water. After that, I pulled the folded memo from my bag and placed it in the top drawer of the desk. Not as a trophy. Just where records belong. The next morning, I did not open my laptop right away. I swept the kitchen first. There were a few dry leaves near the door from where I had trucked them in the day before, and a fine line of dust along the baseboard under the radiator. I swept slowly, emptied the pan, rinsed the coffee mug I had left by the sink, and folded the dish towel over the oven handle so it sat straight. Then I opened the window a few inches and let the cool air move through the room. That was how I wanted the day to begin. Not with alerts. Not with contracts. Just with simple things returning to order. The email from counsel arrived at 8:12. The subject line was exactly what I expected: interim engagement terms and governance updates. No apology in the title. No unnecessary warmth. Just the document, a summary of revised controls, and a request to review when convenient. I read the message once while standing at the counter. The revisions were sensible. Formal reporting line. Documented authority. Dual approval for any transition touching monitored trust architecture. Required handoff procedures. Named ownership rather than buried ownership. It was, in other words, the structure that should have existed before anyone decided a hidden function was the same thing as an unimportant one. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I made tea and carried it to the desk. The memo Scott had signed was still in the top drawer where I had left it. The interim letter sat beside the keyboard. Morning light stretched across the wood in a pale rectangle. Somewhere below my window, a delivery truck idled for a minute, then moved on. There was no anger left in me by then. That part had already burned away. What remained was clearer than anger. A sense of weight returning to the right places. A system restored. A record closed. Boundaries redrawn where they should have been all along. Around 9:30, Adrian sent a shorter note. No pressure today. Review when ready. Also, thank you again. I looked at it for a moment, then put the phone face down. He meant it. I knew that. But gratitude, while welcome, does not undo carelessness. It simply belongs in the record beside it. By late morning, I signed the interim terms with 2 small changes. I added language on transition notice. I added language on document retention. Then I sent it back. That was all. No ceremony. After lunch, I walked to the little pharmacy 2 blocks over to pick up dish soap and batteries. The sidewalk was dry from yesterday's weather. A woman outside the florist was rearranging buckets of white lilies near the door. A man in running shoes stood at the corner waiting for the light with a paper bag tucked under one arm. Across the street, someone was wiping down the outdoor tables at a cafe even though they did not need wiping yet. Everything looked ordinary. I think that is what peace usually looks like. Not triumph. Just ordinary things staying ordinary. When I got home, I put the batteries in the kitchen drawer, slid the soap under the sink, and sorted a stack of unopened mail into 3 piles at the table. Utilities. Insurance. Trash. Then I watered the plant on the sill that I sometimes forget for a few days at a time. It needed more than I had been giving it. I stood there until the excess water drained through into the saucer. That afternoon, a junior engineer from Norvale sent me a private note through the approved channel. She kept it brief and careful. She said she had watched everything from a distance and had not realized until this week how easy it was for good work to disappear when it lived in the wrong place. She asked whether I had any advice for someone early in her career. I read her message twice. Then I answered with 3 lines. Make your work legible. Keep your approvals. Never confuse being quiet with being unprotected. She thanked me, and that could have been the end of it. but it stayed with me longer than I expected. Because the truth is, there is always another person in a building somewhere doing the useful work no one knows how to name until someone tries to remove it. Another analyst, another developer, another operations manager, someone careful, someone buried, someone learning too late that invisibility can feel efficient right up until it becomes dangerous. A week from now, it might be someone else with a folded memo in a bag and a room full of people suddenly asking what went wrong. If that happens, I suppose I will know what to tell them. That evening, I cleaned the desk properly. I recycled old notes that no longer mattered, shredded duplicates, labeled one folder for active agreements and another for completed matters. I moved the memo to a sealed envelope with the date written neatly across the front and placed it in the file box with the vendor agreement and the restoration logs. Then I wiped down the desk surface and turned off the lamp. The room looked lighter after that. Before bed, I made one last cup of tea and stood by the window again. The parking lot below was quiet. A porch light across the courtyard flicked on. Somewhere nearby, a television was playing softly through an open window, too faint to make out the words. I took a sip, held the warm cup in both hands, and let the silence stay exactly as it was. No victory speech. No final lesson dressed up to sound larger than life. Just this: read what people sign. Keep what proves the sequence. And when the noise starts, let the record speak first. If you stayed with me to the end, I'm glad you were here. Please like and subscribe if this kind of calm, true story is what you come here for. And in the comments, tell me which city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always like seeing where these stories land. 2 popular stories will appear next, and I think you'll like both of them.